You know, whenever the Second Amendment comes up today, the conversation almost always jumps right into our modern world. But what if I told you that the real story behind it is rooted in a fierce, totally practical debate from the Revolutionary War? A debate that, for the most part, has been completely forgotten.
So let's just dive right in. I want you to put yourself back there. You're a bunch of colonies, and you've decided to take on the most powerful military on the planet. You don't have a professional army. You don't have a navy. You don't even really have a central government to pay for one. So what's your first, most basic problem? It's this question right here. How in the world do you build an army that can actually win?
Well, the answer wasn't simple at all, because it basically forced the colonists to choose between two really powerful and totally competing ideas. On one hand, you had the ideal of the citizen soldier, an army of the people, regular folks fighting for liberty. But on the other hand, you had the very real, very pragmatic need for a professional soldier, a trained, disciplined force that was built to win. And the tension between these two ideas, it would shape literally everything. Every battle, every decision, and eventually the Second Amendment itself.
To really get the scale of this whole debate, we first have to understand who was actually doing the fighting. See, the American forces weren't just one army, not by a long shot. It was more like a patchwork of different groups, all with very different ideas about what they were signing up for.
Okay, so this slide kind of breaks it all down. First up, you've got the local militia. These guys were the backbone of defense in the colonies for like 100 years. They were part-timers, mostly focused on defending their own towns. Then you have the Minutemen, who were mostly famous up in New England. Think of them as the special forces of the militia, better trained and ready to go at a minute's notice. And finally, you have the Continental Army. This was the big attempt to build a real professional national force, with soldiers who signed up for the long haul.
And in that crazy first year of the war, the militia looked absolutely unstoppable. I mean, at Lexington, Concord, and especially at Bunker Hill, these citizen soldiers handed the British a stunning defeat. These victories were so huge that they created this powerful national myth that a fired-up militia fighting for freedom was all America would ever need to win. But for the guy in charge, that myth was a seriously dangerous illusion.
And this brings us right to the heart of the matter, the big ideological clash of the Revolution. This wasn't just about strategy or tactics. This was about the kind of country they were trying to build.
You see, this fear of a professional army, it wasn't new. It went way, way back. Thinkers like George Mason were looking back at ancient history, at the Roman Republic. They believed Rome was strong because of its citizen soldiers, farmers and citizens who fought for the state and then went back home. The Second Rome created a permanent professional army, they argued. That army became a tool for tyrants, and that was the beginning of the end for the Republic.
So here you can see the two sides laid out perfectly. The Republican ideal was just steeped in this historical fear. A permanent, standing army was seen as the first step towards another king, a direct threat to the liberty they were fighting for. But the pragmatic need was just as strong. Commanders on the ground knew that if they were going to face the British Redcoats, one of the best armies in the world, they needed an army built on that same European model, professional, disciplined, and trained for the brutal reality of war.
And you know who was firmly in that pragmatic camp? The commander-in-chief himself, George Washington. His vision wasn't just theory. It was forged in the fire of his own experience.
This timeline really shows how Washington's whole career pushed him towards professionalism. Back in the French and Indian War, he fought right alongside British regulars and saw their discipline up close. He studied the great European armies, especially the legendary Prussian army of Frederick the Great. And then, bam, the disastrous fall of New York in 1776 proved his worst fears right. The militia, as brave as they were, just crumbled against a professional assault. This is what led him to adopt his famous Fabian strategy, basically a war of attrition, avoiding big battles just to buy precious time to train his Continental Army into a real fighting force.
And man, you can just feel the absolute frustration in his own words. After those failures in '76, he wrote these desperate letters to Congress, basically pleading with them to get it. He was convinced that the revolution could not be won with part-time soldiers. For him, relying on the militia was a strategic dead end.
At the end of the day, this was his unshakable belief. For Washington, modern war took more than just courage. It required soldiers who were hardened by relentless training and discipline. He was absolutely convinced that only a standing professional Continental Army could truly win their independence.
And this is a huge but. This is where the story gets way more complicated. Because while Washington was right about needing a professional army, he was maybe wrong to dismiss the militia so completely. The citizen soldier wasn't just a myth. They turned out to be absolutely essential.
You really see the whole narrative flip when the war moves to the south. After the Continental Army suffers a series of just devastating losses, it was the militias in the Carolinas that kept the revolution from completely falling apart. They proved they could play a role that no professional army ever could.
So what were they actually doing? Well, a little bit of everything. They were perfect for guerrilla warfare, constantly hitting British supply lines and tying down thousands of their troops. On top of that, they acted like a local police force, putting down loyalist uprisings that could have started a full-blown civil war. They also gave the Continental Army these critical boosts in manpower right before big battles. And they won! They secured huge, decisive victories at places like Kings Mountain and Cowpens that totally changed the momentum of the war.
But even with all that success, that old tension was always there. This quote from General Nathanael Greene, who was Washington's best general in the South, just captures the paradox perfectly. He was a master at using the militia to win his campaign, but he was also constantly complaining about their lack of discipline. The fact that they listened to local politicians over him drove him crazy. It's like he was saying, I need these guys, but man, they're impossible to command. So the war ends, America wins, but that deep, unresolved tension between needing a professional army and fearing a professional army, it spills right over into the debate about the new Constitution. And this is one of the biggest ironies in American history. The Continental Army, Washington's professional force, had done it. They'd secured victory. But the second the threat was gone, that old fear of a standing army came roaring back. A lot of Americans suddenly saw it not as a savior, but as a potential weapon for a new, powerful federal government.
The whole debate over the Constitution really brought this conflict to a head. On one side, you had the Federalists, guys like Hamilton, who wanted a strong central government that could raise a national army for common defense. But on the other side, the anti-Federalists were terrified that this new federal army could one day be used to march into a state, disarm its militia, and impose tyranny. The solution? It was a grand compromise, the Bill of Rights, which was specifically designed to calm those fears and reassure the states that their rights and their militias would be safe.
Okay, we have to stop for a second and talk about the language here, because this is key. When we hear the word regulated today, we think of government rules and laws. But back in the 18th century, well-regulated meant something totally different. It meant well-trained, well-disciplined, effective. You know, exactly what Washington had wanted for his army all along. A well-regulated militia wasn't just a random group of people. It was meant to be a disciplined fighting force.
And so we finally arrive at the text itself. You can see now that it's this incredible masterpiece of compromise, born directly out of the conflict we've just been talking about. It speaks to that Republican ideal, the idea that a militia is necessary to the security of a free state, and it also protects a right of the people. It's an attempt to finally resolve this single biggest military and political question of the entire revolution.
So I want to leave you with this question. Now that we've walked through this forgotten debate, this clash between the ideal of the citizen soldier and the pragmatic need for a professional army, how does that change the way we read those first four incredibly important words of the Second Amendment? It reminds us that behind that text, there's a huge, fierce debate about what it really takes to not only win a revolution, but to keep a state free.